Work. All right, so I think we're live. Everybody at home, forget what we just did. We were still trying to get these new things to work, and it's not working right. I just want to ask a question, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but just to get you thinking. What do you think the point has been in our discussion so far over the last 6 weeks? Anybody want to just offer a couple of words or a short sentence opinion? Those of you that have been here. Those of you that remember what we've been talking about.
What's the topic?
That's always my deepest fear. It's like 51st dates. You come back the next time and you don't have any idea what's going on.
Everything is evidence-based?
Say that again.
Based on evidence rather than fact?
What is?
Yeah.
Okay, God, the Bible, our faith.
Right.
Okay, absolutely. I'm trying to emphasize, and I always have in every class I've ever taught for most of my life, that why we believe is just as important as what we believe. And I think a lot of people don't think about that. All right? Why we believe, there's got to be reasons. There's got to be a basis for it. Okay? What we've done so far is we've talked about evidence for a creator and for the Bible itself being written by that creator, and that evidence for the writing part of it comes in a wide variety of forms. Okay, actually all of it, whether it's the evidence for a creator or for the creator having that writing, comes in a wide variety of forms. Sometimes we get one or two of these in our head, which is great, and we use those as our main points of hanging on to or to explaining. But one of the things I'm trying to do is show you that there is an overwhelming amount of kinds of evidence from very, very different directions. So, for instance, we talked about outside evidence, and I'm just going to do a very, very quick review because I was asked last week because it's hard to remember. So, first slide, Aaron, please. We talked about transitional forms. We talked about symbiotic relationships found everywhere in nature. We talked about irreducible complexity. We talked about the laws of nature that are broken under a random chance-based system, like the first and second law of thermodynamics, and there are others. And then my favorite, of course, was the fact that if true atheistic evolution is true, then we have to explain somehow how we have a mind that can think, that can analyze, that can function, and to me, that being answered in a way that says that we started out as a rock or a gas or a vapor or whatever it is, that was the first thing, and through chemistry and electricity we got to this level, to me is absolutely absurd. Okay? But yet, many, many fields of the social sciences are built on that basis. You don't even know it when you go into study psychology that you are talking about nature versus nurture for a reason. It's because free will, even though they say you have some free will is basically almost like Johnny Five, that little robot that got his own mind in that movie called Short Circuit. All right? That's us to a lot of people. All right? We weren't created with that ability. We gained that ability. That's what psychology is based on, guys, for the most part. It took me a long time to realize that. And therefore, if you add a little bit of salt and you add a little bit of flour and you can change people's behavior because it evolved that way so we can evolve it a different way. Once you start realizing this, you realize that so many things start making more sense as to why they're done the way they're done. Then we talked a lot about the other categories under the heading of inside information. Inside information, of course, is the evidence that is found inside the Bible itself. I've got a lot of books written by with just as many PhDs by their names as the guys that don't believe this is true, that don't believe in God, that don't believe the Bible is true. There are so many of them out there that they still have PhDs, and yet they are ridiculed by the ones that believe the dogma, okay? And you don't hear about them because they're suppressed. Trust me, I have a whole library full of these guys. They're very, very smart. The opposition in any argument often looks more overwhelming, not because it is right, but because they have a hold on the means of communication and communicating their ideas so that they sound bigger than they are. And one of the reasons I can make that statement is because of people that I've read, it's people that I have talked to. John Clayton, a lot of you know who he is or even have seen him, all right? Member of the church, been working his entire life going around talking about, does God exist? That's his organization. He's very old now, but he's done this every weekend his entire life on top of his regular job. John Clayton and I have had more than one conversation. I do not know him personally, but I have talked to him personally on occasions, and he told me that. He worked for Madeleine O'Hair's organization, and he says, you cannot believe how small the actual number of people that are dogmatically for this, but they know how to advertise it and they know how to make it sound bigger than it is so that you can't say anything else, even if you're a scientist with a PhD by your name. Same thing is true with a book I read by F. LaGard Smith, another member of the church that's a lawyer. He's taught at some of the universities in the Brotherhood, and he says the same thing about on a totally different topic, that the organization behind what they're trying to push is way smaller than what it looks, but they know how to push the right buttons to make themselves look like they are. So in other words, even though this looks like everybody in the world believes it, it is not true. All right? I'm convinced of that. We have inside information that we talked about quite a little bit. Go ahead, next slide, please. And we talked about prophecies that Jesus, that happened a long time before Jesus and how they came true. We haven't gone into detail of those in this particular class because it's a whole class by itself, and Nathan has been planning on doing something along that line, so I'm going to let him do that. But books like Isaiah are chock full of these things. Some of you probably can even know what they are, but all the prophets do this. And we've discussed in other classes, in past classes, the foreshadowing and the typology for several years now that's in the Bible. The way that the different books are so interrelated to each other, and yet those people didn't know each other because they were spread out over a 1,000-year period of time. It's impossible for them to have put this together in such a way that it tells that same story about the same promised seed over and over and over again. We listened to Peter Williams talk about the comparison of names that are used by secular writings and those that are used in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts, and then compared those to what the Gnostic Gospels written around the 3rd century say, which most people today want to believe those 3rd century ones because they fit the narrative, and say that these couldn't have been the only Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John couldn't have been the only ones, and they're probably not even the right ones, and they were probably doctored. And yet you can go back and we have not just 4 or 5 of them or one of them or whatever. We got what? Tens of thousands of copies, which no other place has. Do you see how the little bit of evidence keeps mounting and mounting and mounting with all these different scenarios? We looked at some people that talked about the stone and the clay and the other materials that are in documents that tell historical events that cross over into the Bible, and how they are true. Battles that were fought, important people that are discussed, and places and nations that are discovered. Not only that, nations and places and people that they said for a long time could not even be true. The Bible was making it up, and then they would find the Hittites, or they'd find this particular ruler, and they'd find this particular contract that was the same as a contract in the Bible that they didn't think could exist. And it happens over and over and over again. Cities, nations, people, treaties, all found after the Bible was previously ridiculed for saying that they existed. As we have said over and over again, no one piece of evidence is overwhelming, and no amount of evidence can ever prove anything beyond 100% surety. But the more evidence that mounts, the more the scale is tilted in one direction or another. So I want to talk a little bit, and I'm not going to try to get technical. We're going to do a little math today, all right, to show you what I'm talking about. And for those of you that have done a little bit of study in that direction, you know the difference between an inductive proof and a deductive proof. You don't have to memorize that for a test today, all right? But basically, induction, you use a whole bunch of little specific examples to show something is true, whereas a deductive proof, you use generally accepted theorems and postulates that prove beyond the shadow of a doubt that something has to be right. And if you've taken a geometry class in the past, you kind of know what that is. So, one of the things I use when I teach that, whether it was in high school or college, is I would always use the statement, because this is what was told to me by philosophy teachers and mathematics teachers, is what happens if you make the statement, all deer have white tails? Can you prove that? Can you prove that statement beyond the shadow of a doubt? No, you cannot. Why not, Bill?
Because you can't get know of every deer.
You can find thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of examples, but you can't, like Bill just said, ever see every single deer simultaneously at the same time, or even be able to tag them enough to know there's not one hiding in the corner someplace. Okay? So you can't prove it with examples. Yes? Yeah, now you're ruining my example. You're the first person to ever do that on me. That's okay. That's okay. I've thought of that, but I've never brought it up because all right. So you can't prove anything beyond the shadow of a doubt by observation. All right. Let's look at another example. So next slide. All right. So this is another thing I would use. We take a number, we multiply it by 2, then we take the number we got and we add 6, and we take the number we got and divide that by 2, and then we take that number and we subtract the original number from it and get a result. Next slide. When we start with 12, that's what we get. Next slide. When we start with 5, that's what we get. Next slide. When we start with 1, that's what we get. All right? You don't have to know the math, just trust me. I've done this in classes with 20, 30 people. Have everybody pick a different number. Have everybody work it out. Of course, there's 2 or 3 that made a mistake, and then we have to find the mistakes. And eventually, I have everybody, what number did you pick? What number did you get? What number did you pick? What number did you get? And everybody gets 3. Did we prove it beyond the shadow of a doubt? And everybody goes, yeah. No, this is the deer in the white with a white tail. You can't prove it by examples. All right? Next slide. There's the algebra. You can prove it. That proves it beyond the shadow of a doubt because we use the general any number, x. Now, why did I do that? What we have as evidence, okay? What we have as evidence that we've been talking about is like finding all the deer with white tail. It's like the first 3 examples here. It is not a smoking gun like the last one. And I want to tell you something big. The science doesn't have it either when it comes to evolution. They only have examples. They claim that they proved it. Then why do they still call it the theory of evolution? Because they have not. And I have read scientific books by scientific people with PhDs that one of them even says, in the beginning of his book, he says, I went through my bachelor's degree, my master's degree, and it wasn't until I was in my PhD that I realized they haven't proved anything. They've made assumption after assumption after assumption. They're looking at the same evidence that we are. They're coming up with a different conclusion, and they're coming to that conclusion for a very specific reason. They don't want to believe. And we've already had examples of that in class so far. So, with inductive reasoning, and that's what we have to use in our quest to, like we said, find out why we believe, we have to use inductive reasoning. We have to use examples. Where do those examples point? That's what we have to ask ourselves. Although no amount of assumption will ever prove that if you follow these particular steps, the answer will always be a certain way, the more that we have the results pointing in that direction, the more assured you can be that you're probably headed in the right direction, right? That's why I'm giving you all kinds from various wide variety of sources and wide variety of things that allow us to do that. Go to the next slide. Okay, remember what George Wald said? We choose to believe the impossible because of our philosophical bias. I mean, that's a paraphrase of the last sentence that he said. He's one of the honest ones. Let me just put it that way. There is no smoking gun when it comes to knowing whether or not there is a God, whether that God wrote the Bible. That took me a lot of years to figure out. There isn't any. Okay? So you have to go through this sort of thing to come up with it. And after a while, you go, look, this can't be explained any other way. In today's world, the words millions, billions, and trillions are mentioned a lot. To the point where if you're not a math person, they almost sound like they're the same thing. You know? A million, a trillion, big deal. No big deal. Next slide. Do you realize that 1 is to a million as a million is to a trillion? So in other words, a million times a million equals a trillion. There's a huge difference between those. Huge difference. In fact, you could spend $1 million a year. How long would it take you to spend $1 trillion doing that?
Depends on if the U.S. government or not.
Well, we're not getting taxed. This was a free donation. $1 million years. It would take you $1 million years to spend $1 million a year and use it all up. That's how big a trillion is compared to a million. Now, there's a point that I'm going to be making here in a minute, all right? So, the shorthand way of writing these kinds of numbers, next, is a million is 10 to the 6th power because there are 6 zeros on a million, all the way down to a trillion has 12 zeros, so it's 10 to the 12. So it's not, I mean, students will look at that and go, well, a trillion is twice as much as a million because 12 is twice as much as 6. No, that's not how it works, okay? That's not how it works at all. It's a lot bigger. So, you know, years ago in our government, we had millions of dollars of debt. Now we have trillions. People don't think anything of it. You should be scared. It's a lot more. All right, So what I want to do is I want to go through a couple of exercises here and show you how odds are created. Just a simple little thing on it. Now I did this, I looked back in my notes, I did this about 15 years ago. So some of you may remember this, but most of you won't. Next slide. So if we flip a coin, what's the odds that I would get a tail, that I would get a heads? 50%. Now, when I do this at school, when I taught, I'd flip a coin, flip a coin, flip a coin in front of the class, and I got heads, 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 heads. That's because Rob Victor had made me a double-headed coin. Okay? It was one of my former students that is now head of his own company in New York. Pretty cool kid. Well, he's not a kid anymore, but yeah, he made me one of those. I still have it someplace, but I couldn't find it this morning to bring it over. So what would happen if you flip it 10 times? What would you expect? And you don't usually get perfect, maybe 6 and 4. But if you get like 20 kids in a class, all with a coin, and you start having them flip, and they keep track, and then you take those thousands that they got in the class hour and put them together, it works. You get really close to half and half. All right? That's just the way it works. Next slide. Spinner. If you've got a legal spinner, when I do this in some classes, when I feel better, I actually start spinning it and everything. If you got 10 things on the spinner, you got a 1 in 10 chance. And if you spin it 10 times, you should, you don't usually, you're going to have to probably spin it 1,000 times, but you should get an equal number of each one of the numbers on it if it's done correctly. You know, if it's not cheating, if it's not like hitting at some point so it stops it or whatever. All right? So the Wheel of Fortune, you know, is supposed to be legal. It works. What if I wanted to know the odds of getting a a head? If I was to flip a coin and spin afterwards, that I got a heads and I got a 5 on the spinner. What would be the odds that those two would happen? What's that? No. Much less than that. It would be. Go ahead. It is. Okay, you just multiply the fractions. 1 over 2 times 1 over 10. 1 out of 20. Next slide. What if we have to pick a specific card? That's 1 out of 52. All right? So if we're going to figure out if I'm going to go 1 out of 2, if I'm going to get in heads, then I'm going to get a 5 on the spinner, and then I'm going to get the ace of spades. How do I figure that? It's 1/2 times 1/10 times 1/52nd, which is 1 out of a little over 1,000. So it's a 1 out of 1,000 chance. See how it gets more and more less likely the more things you do? Now the next one, next slide please. I picked this number 977 for a reason, because when I multiply all those together after this, what I get if I take, go to the next slide. I think maybe, yeah, I've actually done that. 1/2. If I got a coin, I got a heads. I got a number 5 on the spinner. I got a ace of spades or a specific card, and then I'm going to pick one specific marble that is different from all the other marbles. Okay, every marble is different in that 977 marble bag, and I reach in there and I pick out the one that I want. Multiply them together. What do you get? Next slide. It's about 1 in a million. Okay? About a 1 in a million chance that it could happen. Lotto tickets most lotto tickets, the big ones, are way worse than that. Okay? Yeah, I knew a guy that bought a lotto ticket once, long time ago when I worked in the factory. I asked him, have you ever bought one? He says, yeah, I bought one once. I didn't win, so I never bought it anymore. He was serious. Where am I at? According to CBS News, and I looked this up, I got a few things that I've looked at over the past. I looked this one up this week. CBS News said the odds of winning the 2018 $1 billion lottery, I don't know if you remember that, but I think that might have been the first one that was $1 billion, maybe not. But they said that it was, go ahead, next slide, 1 in 10 to the 15th, which is 1 in 1 quadrillion. Gets pretty big pretty fast, doesn't it? But that's still doable because somebody won that one, didn't they? All right, if I remember right, somebody, I mean, it's not still growing, so somebody won it. How big are the odds? How big do the odds need to be before they can say that an event will never happen unless somebody has cheated or has fixed the results? Well, there just happens to be a guy, he's passed away now, but he lived well into our lifetimes, named Emile Borel, another guy with a PhD by his name. He was a statistician and a probability expert in mathematics. He was French. And he formulated a basic law of probability. Next slide. Here's what he said. The occurrence of any event where the chances are beyond 1 in 1 followed by 50 zeros, in other words, 1 in 10 raised to the 50th power, is an event which can be stated with certainty will never happen, no matter how much time is allotted and no matter how many conceivable opportunities could exist for that event to take place. In other words, you could have that many marbles in a bag, dive into it, and with your eyes closed, and pick as many times as you wanted, put it back, mix them up, put it back, mix it up, and you'd never get the one you wanted. Ever. Ever. A while back, I was watching a video, a movie, this was several years ago, about the odds of the universe happening by accident. And in physics, there is a whole bunch of precise formulas and things that have to be perfectly accurate or the universe and life is not possible. All right? John Clayton talks about this, and some other scientists that I have in books talk about this a fair amount. And at the time, they had estimated that the probability of this happening by chance was 1 in 10 with more zeros on it than what this guy says is 53 zeros instead of 50. That was then. They know more now. Characteristics of a planet that can support life has many factors. The oxygen, the water, how large the land masses are, the sun being the right temperature and the right mass and the right distance, the orbit around that sun, the moon, the moon for stabilization, magnetic fields, specific place in the galaxy are all important factors. If you want to know those, look up some of these things because there's scientists that go into detail on this stuff as to how unlikely it is. The chance that, is another example, the chance that a very simple system composed of 200 integrated parts. Now, when we talk about integrated parts, we're talking about that, what was that terminology? Thank you. Yes, irreducible complexity. We're talking about an irreducibly complex, like the human body. We saw that movie video on that. With only 200 parts. We've got way more than 200 parts. But it was like we're a really complex mousetrap or a really complex bacterial flagellum like we discussed. That calculation comes out to 1 in 10 to the 375 power. Or Scott Hughes in his book, I can't recall the name of the book right now, states that the probability that an eye could evolve, this is the human eye, not the other eyes that are out there that are different, the eye that could evolve by chance is 1 in 10 to the 266th power. That's kind of a lot bigger than 50. All right, I want to take a quick look at a 5-minute video, and then I've got a couple things to sum up with. So, Nathan, go ahead and...
In 1966, Time magazine ran a cover story asking, "Is God dead?" The cover reflected the fact that many people had accepted the cultural narrative that God is obsolete, that as science progresses, there's less need for a God to explain the universe. It turns out, though, that the rumors of God's death were premature. In fact, perhaps the best arguments for his existence come from, of all places, science itself. Here's the story. The same year Time featured its now famous headline, the astronomer Carl Sagan announced that there were 2 necessary criteria for a planet to support life: the right type of star and a planet the right distance from that star. Given the roughly octillion planets in the universe, that's 1 followed by 24 zeros, there should have been about septillion planets, that's 1 followed by 21 zeros, capable of supporting life. With such spectacular odds, scientists were optimistic that the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, known by its initials SETI, an ambitious project launched in the 1960s, was sure to turn up something soon. With a vast radio telescopic network, scientists listened for signals that resembled coded intelligence. But as the years passed, the silence from the universe was deafening. As of 2014, researchers have discovered precisely bubbles, not zilch, which is to say 0 followed by an infinite number of zeros. What happened? As our knowledge of the universe increased, it became clear that there were, in fact, far more factors necessary for life, let alone intelligent life, than Sagan supposed. His 2 parameters grew to 10, then 20, and then 50, which meant that the number of potentially life-supporting planets decreased accordingly. The number dropped to a few thousand planets and kept on plummeting. Even SETI proponents acknowledged the problem. Peter Schenkel wrote in 2006 piece for Skeptical Inquirer, a magazine that strongly affirms atheism, "In light of new findings and insights, we should quietly admit that the early estimates may no longer be tenable." Today, there are more than 200 million parameters necessary for a planet to support life, every single one of which must be perfectly met or the whole thing falls apart. For example, without a massive gravity-rich planet like Jupiter nearby to draw away asteroids, Earth would be more like an interstellar dartboard than the verdant orb that it is. Simply put, the odds against life in the universe are astonishing. Yet, here we are, not only existing, but talking about existing. What can account for it? Can every one of those many parameters have been perfectly met by accident? At what point is it fair to admit that it is science itself that suggests that we cannot be the result of random forces? Doesn't assuming that an intelligence created in perfect conditions in fact require far less faith than believing that a life-sustaining Earth just happened to meet the inconceivable odds? But wait, there's more. The fine-tuning necessary for life to exist on the planet is nothing compared with the fine-tuning required for the universe to exist at all. For example, astrophysicists now know that the values of 4 fundamental forces, gravity, the electromagnetic force, and the strong and weak nuclear forces, were determined less than 1/1,000,000th of a second after the Big Bang. Alter any one of these 4 values ever so slightly, and the universe as we know it could not exist. For instance, the ratio between the strong nuclear force and the electromagnetic force had been off by the tiniest fraction, the tiniest inconceivable fraction, then no stars could have formed at all. Multiply that single parameter by all the other necessary conditions, and odds against the universe existing are so heart-stoppingly astronomical that the notion that it all just happened defies common sense. It would be like tossing a coin and having it come up heads 10 quintillion times in a row. I don't think so. Fred Hoyle, the astronomer who coined the term Big Bang, said that his atheism was greatly shaken by these developments. One of the world's most renowned theoretical physicists, Paul Davies, has said that the appearance of design is overwhelming. Even the late Christopher Hitchens, one of atheism's most aggressive proponents, conceded that without question the fine-tuning argument was the most powerful argument of the other side. Oxford University professor of mathematics Dr. John Lennox has said, "The more we get to know about our universe, the more the hypothesis that there is a creator gains in credibility as the best explanation of why we're here. The greatest miracle of all time is the universe. It is the miracle of all miracles, one that inescapably points to something or someone beyond itself." I'm Eric Taxis for Prager University.
Today's scientists are attempting to downplay these massive odds. And for their own reasons. For instance, in doing this research, I found an article that I had never seen before, this week actually, just a few days ago, when I was looking up some things on Borel's law that we just talked about. And there's a guy named Rupert Tyler, never heard of him before, that talked about this very thing in an article he wrote, Borel's law of probability. And this is recent, it's August of 2022. Next slide, please. This is what he said in that article, just one of the sentences. He said, if Borel's law is immutably true and the creationists are wrong, then you can't exist. You cannot exist. However, as the astute who do exist, who's he talking to? He's acting like we don't exist, and he's talking about the astute, which are the people that believe like him. For the astute that do exist will have observed extremely improbable events do actually occur. What's he talking about? He's saying, we're here, aren't we? Therefore, those odds can't be that big a deal. Why? Because he's still not believing in God no matter what. He's trying to make you sound stupid for believing. Because he's claiming that they proved it, which they have not. He's just making that assumption. I read a blog where they had a whole, this week also, where they had a whole bunch of people giving opinions on this same sort of thing, what the odds were. And one of them said, it's already happened, the odds are 1-to-1, which means there is no odds against. They're looking at it stupidly as far as I'm concerned. Do you get what it is I'm trying to show with that statement, everybody? Yes?
They want to believe and nothing's going to change their mind.
Yeah, and they're still assuming that it can't happen the other way, so that it happened their way, and it happened, therefore the odds can't be telling the truth. I mean, we add into this the predictions that are made by the Bible. We've talked in the past about the idea of only 48 predictions made about Jesus and coming true hundreds and even thousands, up to 1,000 years later, are like 1 in 10 raised to the 157th power. Way bigger than 50. But that's only 48. There's 300 or more about Jesus, and there's 800 or more about all the other nations and stuff. It's so ridiculously impossible for this to have happened any other way, yet you can't convince. The odds become so incalculable in favor of someone or something knowing what would happen before it happened. It seems impossible for all of this to have happened by accident. I believe that the Bible is the right religious book, and that there is a God, and that I believe that because the author gave an undeniable mountain of evidence, both inside and outside of that book, to show his eternal power and deity. The odds are too great for these predictions to have happened accidentally by chance, or for the universe to have happened by chance, whichever side you're going to look at. It seems impossible. It is like God was creating a universe and was writing a book with the goal in mind of two things. Number one, show us who that promised seed was. That's the primary reason. But at the same time, writing it and creating it in such a way so that we have the breadcrumbs to know that it's true. So in a simple sense, God can walk and chew gum at the same time. He told us a story, and he proved the story has to be true. But he did it with examples, not with out-and-out proof. What would be the out-and-out proof that there's God? Guess what? Adam and Eve knew beyond the shadow of a doubt because they walked with him and they talked with him. But when man sinned, we were separated. And that's why we have to go on evidence now. We have to go on faith. Next slide. Last slide. I had a whole bunch of these. I had like 8 or 10 of these. I picked the best one because I knew I was going to run out of time. The excessive skepticism of many liberal theologians stems not from a careful evaluation of the available data, but instead from an enormous predisposition against the supernatural. On the whole, however, archaeological work has unquestionably strengthened confidence in the reliability of the spiritual record, and it has strengthened our confidence in the accuracy with which the text has been transmitted through the centuries. That's by a Yale archaeologist. Now, I believe this particular one is dead now, but I have at least 10 of these quotes by guys with PhDs. Now, next week, we're going to take the next phase of this, and we're finally going to get to Jill's question. We are. That's the whole point of this class. I wanted the overwhelming amount of evidence first because we're going to get into stuff that some of you have heard me talk about before, but I'm going to put it all in one great big, there's going to be several lessons on some things that the Bible predicts about nations, and unless we know a lot of history, we don't even know that those predictions came true. All right? Jill's question was, you probably don't even remember it anymore. She in a sense, asked what actually happened to Assyria and Nineveh in the aftermath of Jonah's preaching and Nahum's condemnation. Do you remember that now? Okay? I took note of that because that was an important question, and it wasn't the right class to actually go into that. But we're going to go into that, and we're going to go into it in a lot of detail. We're not going to just talk about Assyria and Nineveh. We're going to talk about a lot of different nations back at that during Bible times. Okay? What the prophets said would happen to them, what God said he would do to them, and what actually happened to those nations, which is, as far as I'm concerned, a whole nother level of this kind of mounting evidence. Any questions? Comments? Thank you for listening. Yeah.
Two very short things. One of them I just found out day before yesterday. We actually know now of about 1,100 planets that are not in our solar system. And I remember when they came up with the first one, okay? Of the 1,100 planets, none of them are capable of sustaining life. For a whole lot of reasons. Some of them are as big as Jupiter, and some of them are, like Mercury, very close to their sun, or whatever. But of the 1,100, not one of them they believe could support life. The other one is the one I found out 2 days ago. They found two wrapped up silver plates that when they unrolled them, this happened a few years ago, but they weren't realized what they were until more recently, that date from Jeremiah's time, 600 years before Christ. That has a quotation from Exodus in it. We talk about how the Dead Sea Scrolls took back 1,000 years of the writing of the Bible, this goes back another 500 years. 2,000, what it would be, 2,600 years ago, we now have a verified quotation from Exodus.
Exodus or Jeremiah?
The day of Jeremiah, from 600,
But it was Exodus. Okay, I got you.
but they're quoting out of Exodus.
Can you send me that article somehow or another?
No, it's an online thing.
I know. Can you send?
It was this guy.
There's ways to do that, Terry. You can.
Yeah, I know. This guy's a archaeologist, he's Israeli, and been working on digging in Israel for his whole lifetime. And it's a little video, I think I could probably find it again, where it goes through this whole thing.
If you can find it and can't get it to me, tell me. I'll come over and get it myself.
I'll do my best.
Thank you.